Bienvenidos. De parte del Colorado Association for Bilingual Education, I welcome you to another production of Si Se Puede. This session, entitled Planning for Cross-Language Transfer in Traditional and Remote Settings, is presented by Valeria Praga-Rodríguez. You can also access Si Se Puede, Teaching and Maintaining Oracy in an Era of Online Learning by Dr. Susan Hopewell in the resources section of cocabe.org. Yo soy Jorge Garcia, Chair and Chief Executive Officer of Colorado's CABE. We believe that no human is illegal. Families should not be separated and no child should be put in a cage. Black lives matter. Language rights are human rights and women's rights are human rights. Love is love. Science is real. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. Our mission is to advocate for and empower learners and communities through the advancement of equitable, asset-based educational policies and programs. We ask you to help us do that by providing your feedback and input. Please go to cocabe.org/survey to help us plan future sessions. Si Se Puede is more than a title. It's a promise and a contract we make with each other. We hope the next hour will be insightful and empowering, and that you will also join us for a virtual CABE Cafe to continue this discussion. I'm happy to introduce you to today's Si Se Puede presenter, Valeria Praga-Rodríguez. She holds an undergraduate degree from Universidad del Salvador, Argentina, and a master's degree from the University of Colorado, Boulder. She's been a bilingual educator in Texas and Colorado, and is currently an instructional coordinator in Denver Public Schools. She's one of the newest members of the CABE Board of Directors. She's an emerging trilingual. Valeria brings a passion for bilingualism, biliteracy, and biculturalism to her work that complements her expertise in the education of emerging bilingual students. Today, she'll be sharing some strategies and ideas on planning for cross-language transfer in traditional and remote settings. Porque sí se puede. Gracias por acompañarnos. Les presento a Valeria Praga-Rodríguez.
Thank you, Jorge. Hello, everybody, and welcome. As I start sharing my screen, I just wanted to share how excited I am to be here today and to present this content that it's very dear to my heart. I love planning and teaching for transfer, and this is something that beyond the research I see at home every day with my two young daughters. So we're gonna get going. The first thing that I wanted to share is that I created a note catcher. This is pretty much an interactive agenda. If you go to this bit.ly link, bit.ly/transfer note catcher, and it's case sensitive, so be sure to have all those capital letters. You can access, it's a Google document. Google is going to force you to make a copy, and then you can access this document. You can save it in your drive or take notes as we go. It has pretty much the basic information and the structure of the presentation, so you have it. So you can review it. With that being said, these are the outcomes that we have for today. We're going to analyze and understand the concept of teaching for cross-language transfer. And then we're going to explore skills and strategies that support strategic connections between Spanish and English, both in the in-person and in the remote setting. Something to say about that is that we're going to explore some of the ways, some of the strategies that you can implement in order to teach for transfer. They're certainly not the only way to do it. So let's get started. The reason why we're talking about teaching in the traditional setting and in remote, it's because we know that this, more than anything, might be the year of flexibility. With the pandemic that we're living, we might very well start in person or remote and have to be back and forth between the scenarios. So anytime that you see this symbol with the plug on the screen, that means that there's an option to teach for transfer from a remote setting using different strategies and apps. So with that being said, this is the agenda that we have for today. As you can see, the presentation is organized in the why, the what, and the how for language transfer. And in knowing that I have a lot to share, this is going to sound very much like a lecture for the next 45 to 50 minutes. So we have created a second part to this series, which is a Cognates Cafe. We would love to see many of you. We have the link to register on the screen, cognates.org/cafe. We're going to be doing this on Saturday at 9 a.m. So this is supposed to be a space where we share our experiences, and we have different educators from across the country and the state of Colorado, so we can further discuss anything that is mentioned today. The chat box will be available. I will be presenting in English and offering some examples in Spanish. So I'm going to be bilingual at some times, but both my colleagues, Paulina Rodriguez Canizares and Liliana Sanchez Cruz, they're both bilingual. So we invite you to share your comments or your questions in whatever language you feel more comfortable in English or Spanish. So with that being said, we're going to start with our agenda, the first agenda item, which has to do with the why. Why should we teach for cross-language transfer? So in order to start exploring the why, I invite you to read this quote from Sonia Soltero, just to ground us in the importance. Bilingual learners' awareness of the differences and similarities between their two languages offers a powerful foundation for developing higher levels of bilingualism and biliteracy. And I really like this quote because it's so positive, right? We want to make sure that when we think about teaching for language transfer, we're always doing it from that asset-based perspective. We really believe, value, and celebrate our students' bilingualism. So the more we explore their linguistic behaviors, the more we can support them in being successful. We know that many of the bilingual learners that we work with are simultaneous bilinguals. We also have some sequential bilinguals that learn one language after another one. But this is, the cross-language transfer is bridging that occurs continuously in our bilingual learner's mind. So we want to make sure that we understand how they communicate based on everything that is happening in their bilingual brains. Research also confirms that the sooner we start helping our students understand the connections between their two languages, the more we can help them in being successful in the future. I really like to use this phrase, English sooner, Spanish longer. I really believe that there's not an age or a certain level of Spanish or English that students need to reach in order to introduce them to another language. So the sooner that we help them understand the connections, the better. We're also faced with a huge paradigm shift today. It wasn't too long ago that we were taught that languages had to be separated, that we had to teach in English and we had to teach in Spanish, and nor the teacher or the students could mix and combine their languages. We know there's a lot of research that confirms that strategic use of languages and making connections between them has a better impact on student learning. So in knowing that, and knowing that all we want is for students to be successful, to be bilingual, to be biliterate, to be able to express themselves in two languages, in all four domains of language, we really believe that we really give them a huge advantage, and we're benefiting students by putting the two languages side by side and showing them the connections. So it's really from a positive perspective that we want to help our students become biliterate. So now that we understand a little bit better why it's so important that we acknowledge students' two languages and we help them make sense of the connections between the two, we're going to move on to the what. What is teaching for cross-language transfer? So in this section, we're going to explore what cross-language is and what it's not. Sometimes it's easier to understand what it's not in order to comprehend what it is. And also we're going to look into 4 types or different ratings for transfer to fully understand how our students use their two languages. So we know that people learning a new language use what they know in one language when learning a new one, right? We have these languages living in our brain constantly, and we use all our resources to make sense of the world and to be able to communicate in either language. So we might see our students saying something like this. This one is more smaller, right? In this picture, we see some young students observing some insects or something on a tree, and they're trying to tell each other like one is smaller than the other one. Children sometimes make this type of errors of approximation because they're really, one language is influencing the other. So as we know that in Spanish, we say, este es más pequeño, and we use that más pequeño, that más in front of the adjective. And they know that in English, you need that suffix ER. So they're putting them together and they're communicating, and we can totally understand what they're saying. So as a teacher, I want to collect all that information to inform my future practice and my future instruction. So this is something that students do. It's beautiful. We want to make sure that we acknowledge it, we value it, we celebrate it, and we take note of it in order to be able to help them understand how the two languages are similar and different. So like I said a few seconds ago, sometimes in order to understand what something is, it helps to understand what it is not. So cross-language transfer is not a program or a curriculum. I'm not here to sell you any curriculum or a set of lessons that you're going to do day 1, day 2, day 3 with a script. It is not simultaneous translation. We're not encouraging anybody to repeat everything in 2 languages. It's not reteaching or duplicating the same lesson previously covered in the other language, right? So it's not like I'm going to teach this main idea lesson in Spanish, and then I want to teach for transfer, and in order to help them make connections, I'm going to reteach it in English. That's not the purpose of it, and we're going to go further into what that means. It is not either just for students above a certain grade level or age. When I started teaching 15 years ago, I remember hearing sometimes saying like, when students get to this level, then you start introducing them to English. If students are not at this access level or ability level, don't get them confused between the 2 languages. There's a lot of research that proves that the younger we introduce them, and if we do it strategically, the more we benefit students. So what language transfer is explicit and strategically planned instruction to promote high order level thinking and cross-language connection. In other words, is the cognitive process of making connections between 2 languages. So it's a process. It's something that happens naturally in a bilingual student or learner of any age. And it's something that, because it happens naturally, sometimes we're going to explore in a few minutes how sometimes it happens where it works, and sometimes it might conduce to some errors. So that's where our instruction, our explicit instruction comes to play. So in order to better understand the concept of cross-language transfer, we're going to explore 4 transfer ratings or types. These 4 transfer ratings come from the University of San Diego. I adapted a little bit some of the examples, but I went to a session a few years ago, and I really like how they organized language transfer into 4 categories, because it really helps us understand the 2 languages when we put them side by side. One of the main reasons why it's important to understand these 4 types of transfer is because we want them to have always an impact on instructional decisions with an asset-based perspective. We want to make sure that we fully understand why our students might be making some errors or approximations, and how to positively help them produce in both languages. So as teachers, once again, I'm going to repeat it several times, but we want to make sure that when we hear and when we read our students' language production, that we always remember that bilinguals come with so much to offer, and they use all their resources in order to communicate. We just want to make sure that we help them understand and produce language in a more successful way. So we're going to be exploring 4 types of transfer, and these are the positive, partial, neutral, and negative transfer. You have all these 4 in your note catcher if you're following in there with the basic definitions and some examples. So let's go into these four. I'm going to provide some examples in order to understand each one of the four. So let's start with positive transfer. Positive transfer is when two patterns are the same and they exist exactly in the same way in both languages, and they easily support biliteracy. In other words, something works perfectly fine in both languages and it's the same, so I don't have to reteach it. One example of this is the sounds that many of the consonants make, both in English and in Spanish. Once the students understand that the letter M says en español es lo mismo. Is the letter for the sound for the letter M, and that applies to a lot of other consonants in both languages. Something else that transfers positively is comprehension skills and strategies. So once I teach what making prediction means, what it involves to make a guess based on the knowledge that you already have, I don't have to reteach how to make predictions in Spanish, right? This skill is the same. I might say it in a different way. I might use different language to express my prediction. In my experience, it really helps when your teaching comes with some TPR, some total physical response. So anytime you say, okay, I'm going to stop here and we're going to make some predictions, do this with me. So if you invite students to make that movement, they're going to associate making predictions to this movement. So then if you say, okay, ahora vamos a frenar y vamos a hacer una predicción, right? They're going to understand exactly what it's asked from them, even though the name is different. They know the concept, they know how to do it. Text features also transfer positively. So in other words, regardless of if they're reading a nonfiction book in Spanish or in English, they understand how to navigate the glossary once it's been taught in one or the other language. The same with the table of context and the index, and many other features. Something else that transfers positively, and it's one of my favorite because it's one of students' favorite things, are cognates. We know that there are different types of cognates. There's some identical cognates or perfect cognates. There's some similar cognates. Here on the screen, we see a lot of animals that share its spelling and its sounds and the meaning in Spanish and English. So we see that some of them are almost identical, except for maybe an accent mark like dragon and dragón. They sound similar, they're spelled the same, and we always picture that animal of a dragon. So teaching cognates really helps expand students' vocabulary, and once we teach a word in one language, then they can make that connection for the meaning in the other language. One way to remember what cognates are and to teach our students, I like this visual of like the 3 superpowers. There's 3 simple rules to understanding when 2 words are cognates. Words have to look similar, sound similar, and mean the same between the 2 languages. I'm going to highlight the fact that they have to mean the same. If words look similar and sound similar, but they don't share meaning, then we're talking about false cognates, and we're going to explore those very shortly. But just to remember, and students love checking, I was like, do they mean the same? Do they sound the same? Yes, they are cognates. And students really enjoy finding cognates as they move through life. And there are many, there are over 20,000 cognates between English and Spanish. One way to help our students with positive transfer in the remote setting is by providing a bilingual dictionary. So this could be a very simple Google Doc where you put the 2 languages side by side with concepts that they might need to know. So definitions of different vocabulary words that they're going to encounter. And then you can create a document that you can record, you can voice record in order to explain to your students, either synchronously or asynchronously. You can do it live. If not, you can use these apps like Loom or Screencastify, which are Google extensions, very, very easy to install. I included tutorials in the resources in the note catcher. But for example, if you have this bilingual dictionary that we see on the screen, at the bottom, you can put something about cognates and how many of the words are cognates, so they don't need to relearn a new definition for a word. In this case, we pay attention to the prefix re and pre and how they're identical in Spanish and English. That transfers perfectly. Recycling, reciclar, that prefix re or re means doing it again. And that's the same in both languages. So I highly recommend that anytime you share a document like this with students during remote learning, that you use some kind of an app to record your voice so you can explain your students how these works. The second type of transfer is the partial transfer. And this is where there are a lot of similarities and similar patterns between English and Spanish, but the teacher might need to do some explicit instruction to make sure to highlight the differences that might exist. One example to understand that is punctuation. We use punctuation, commas, periods, dashes, quotation marks, exclamation points, question marks in both languages. But we know that, for example, when we're asking a question or we are writing a question in Spanish, we need 2 question marks, one in the beginning and one at the end of the sentence. While when we're writing a question in English, we only need the final question mark. So this is something that we bring to our students' attention because we ask questions when we're talking. We teach our students how to change your intonation when you're asking a question, but when it comes to writing, we want to make sure that they understand. And it's very, very likely and very normal to see that students write, "What's your name?" with a question mark in the beginning and one at the end. That's a normal behavior of a bilingual student. We just want to make sure that we have an opportunity to show them side by side. So they understand that even though we use questions in both languages, the way we apply those question marks might be different. Something else that transfers partially is some of the sounds in our alphabet. So we have the letter R, for example, in both languages, but they make different sounds. So we might want to pay very close attention to the fact that the letter R in Spanish can make 2 different sounds depending on where it is on the word and how you write it, if you need a double R in the beginning of a word or not, how it's always when it's in the middle. So we just want to make sure that we explicitly teach that. And the same with the B and the V. In most Spanish-speaking countries, you might say vaca or vaca, and everybody knows that you're talking about the animal. But in English, a word might change its meaning depending on saying B or V. So this is something that our students might need a lot of explicit instruction and also times to practice how to use them. I know my 5-year-old really struggles with this, so she might say, "I'm very excited," right? I totally know what she's saying, but we practice. "Oh, you're very excited. Say it with me. You're very excited." Something else that transfers partially, sometimes it's some of the cognates, and this is a document, this bit.ly. It's also included in the resources in the note catcher, but this is a bilingual document created by a university in New York that shares some rules of cognates depending on its ending. So this is a document that I use a lot when I'm creating lessons and supporting teachers because it shows side by side a lot of the cognates and how their endings. On the screen, we see, for example, one of the rules, how a lot of the words that in Spanish and then to, CTO, in English and then CT, right? So act, acto, compact, compacto, pact, pacto. So it's a great list of resources and it has a lot of rules and it comes in English and in Spanish that it's really worth exploring if you, once students like cognates, they're going to start finding them. So if you start giving them some of the rules and how it applies, it's going to help them with their understanding and also with their writing. So just something to explore and consider. Going back to the bilingual dictionaries, something else that you can do is that when you pay attention to those cognates, you can focus on the ending of the words. Here, for example, we can see on the screen, again, I'm recommending that this is a Google Doc. Then you record your voice over it to explain to students. And we have examples of the airy ending and the aria ending in Spanish. So there's a couple of examples, visionary, visionario, o visionaria. So that's something that you want to highlight. In English, whether you're saying she was a visionary or he was a visionary, the ending is the same. While in Spanish, if it's a she, it's ella fue una visionaria o él fue un visionario. So once again, just paying attention to those and having a simple explanation for students. The third type of transfer is the neutral or zero transfer. So these are the patterns that only exist in one of the languages. So we have some things that are unique to Spanish or unique to English. For example, la letra ñ. We don't have a letra ñ in English. This is a letter that only exists in the Spanish alphabet, and its sound, it's only in the Spanish alphabet. If we're talking about English and Spanish, because we know with other languages we might encounter it, but in English and in Spanish, they don't share this letter. It only exists in Spanish, so we want to have some explicit instruction around it. The digraph TH and the sounds that the TH can make are not sounds that we have a letter for in Spanish. So whether you're saying with or thin, when you're using that digraph in a word, we know that our students might struggle sometimes with pronouncing it, and they might misspell some words. I've seen a lot of students try to write the word the and say D-A, because the D, the letter D in Spanish, is the closest that we have to that sound, the. So just make it very explicit that this is not a letter or a letter combination that we use in Spanish, but we use it a lot in English with two different sounds. Accent marks only exist in Spanish. It's not something that the English language has. And as we know, there's a lot of rules that come with los acentos. So this is something that we want to explicitly teach in Spanish and show them that even though we might stress a syllable in English, we don't need that accent mark on a word, on our letter. When we think about contractions, we do have contractions in Spanish. We have the contractions al y del. When we combine two words, a el, we say al, de el, we say del, but we don't use an apostrophe, which is something very unique to English. In English, in order to, you can combine some of the words and you use an apostrophe to replace one of the letters, like in this example with isn't, is not. That apostrophe or flying comma, like the younger students like to call, is something very unique to English. A place where we use a lot of apostrophes is for possessive nouns. So this is also that is different in English and in Spanish. We don't express possession in Spanish using apostrophe S or any kind of apostrophe. So the way the languages are built are different. So we might hear a student say something like, puedo llevar mis juguetes a madrina's casa. We know what she's saying. We know that she's using, and her English is influencing her production of Spanish. So we never want to correct her and say, that's not how you say it, but you might say, sí, podemos llevar los juguetes a la casa de madrina, right? So here we want to teach our students how in English we use that apostrophe S to express possession, while in Spanish we use the preposition de in our sentence. So some of the differences that we might want to be teaching explicitly. And then the last type of transfer is the negative transfer, which might cause our students to make some approximations or errors because they try to use their Spanish to produce in English or vice versa with things that don't really work. So that's why I like to call these like the oops type of transfer, because our message might be different if we're not using that transfer explicitly or how it's supposed to be. So that's false cognates as are an example of negative transfer, because we might hear our students say, can I have some more soap? And they're trying to ask for sopa or soup, but they're trying to say soap because these are two words that sound very similar. The word soap exists in English, but I'm trying to say sopa. Or I might know what rope to wear, right? And I'm trying to say what ropa. And we see that these are very different words. Rope is a soga, ropa is clothes. So they're not cognates whatsoever, but there is another word that sounds kind of like that. You might be in a situation where you think somebody's pregnant when they're actually really embarrassed. The words embarrassed and pregnant and embarazada are very similar. So you might think that they're cognates. So in this vignette, we see these two ladies having a conversation, and one of them is really confused. And she's finally like, I didn't know you were pregnant, right? And she was never pregnant. She was just trying to see that she was embarrassed. So once again, we want to make sure that students, these words share the meaning. It's not enough that they sound similar and they look similar. They have to share the same meaning. Another thing that might transfer negatively sometimes has to do with the phonology of the languages. How you pronounce and how we pronounce. I say we. I am a sequential bilingual, so I have struggled with this sometimes, both for vowels and consonants. We know that in Spanish, for example, the letter A always says A. Es una vocal que dice A. So I might struggle saying cat, versus cut, because I might always say cut, right? So just a lot of practice with that. Same with bean and bin. Our students, we might hear that our students are producing those sounds not quite as clear. So we want to make sure that we offer a lot of opportunities for them to practice. The same might happen with some of the consonant sounds. It's not the same to say that I have a really strong voice that say that I have a strong voice, right? So how you pronounce that B versus that V might change the meaning of what you're trying to say. So just paying some attention to that and giving students opportunities to practice all these sounds, especially the ones that are different between the two languages. In order to practice in the remote setting and to help our students with both the zero transfer and the negative transfer, I found Seesaw to be a great platform where teachers can teach using a lot of different modalities through videos and pictures and voice recordings. They can upload assignments, they can take from their curriculum and upload it to Seesaw and ask for students to produce in a lot of different ways. Students and families can also upload pictures or upload a video or just take a picture of their work and upload it to Seesaw. So we know that different districts across the country might be choosing different platforms to use. I know in Denver, we had a lot of flexibility in the spring when we went into remote learning. And when we heard from teachers, they really liked Seesaw. From the parent perspective, I thought it was easy to use, both for me and for my daughter. So I highly recommend because we can provide a lot of very explicit instruction, and we might even offer synchronous instruction for our students and then reinforce it through a video or a document, and then ask that our students explain it or upload a picture of what they wrote or what they drew and explain it orally. So this is something that works really well to both teach and hear from students. So those were the 4 types of transfer. You have in your note catcher, you have this summary, a table that looks like this. So hopefully it's clear how our students make connections between the 2 languages, and it's important that we pay attention to those in order to inform our future instruction. Hopefully we have some time on Saturday for those of you who join us at the cafe so we can go deeper into some examples so we can hear from you what you see your students, how you see examples of transferring from your students and how you help them understand their 2 languages. So with that being said, we're going to move on to the last item in our agenda, which is the how. How do we teach for cross-language transfer? There's a variety of ways. There's a lot of different ways to do it, and we're going to explore some ways, some strategies that we can use in the classroom, and both if we're in the classroom actively, like in person with our students, or if we're teaching from home. These are the 4 strategies that we're going to go over today. We're going to go over them very briefly. Each one of them could have a presentation of its own. There's a lot to say about each of them. We're going to talk a little bit more about cognates and creating cognate walls in your classroom. We're going to talk about the bridge as a strategy. We're going to talk about the dictado from Literacy Squared. I know Sue Hopeful is here and maybe Dr. Kathy Escamilla. So hi and thank you. We love this strategy. And then we're also going to explore how to use bilingual books with your bilingual students. So like we said before, there's a lot of different types of cognates. And this might be a very good place to start when you're starting to put languages side by side and helping your students understand their bilingualism. I say that it's a good place to start because we're starting at the word level. We're starting by looking at how a very small piece of language, a word, is the same or not in Spanish and English, and the connections that exist. So we're going to explore some examples. This is one type of poster that you might have in your classroom, and this is something that you can also have at home. If you're teaching, you can have it in the background. You can create a document, a live document that your students add to. But you might have a document that shows your students the different types of cognates. And as your students, once you've taught it, your students are going to start finding cognates all over the place. They're going to find them in the books they read, in the signs they see, and things that they hear. So the power of these posters is that they're live and the students own them. So here you see in this example that it's a cognate with 3 columns. It's a poster with 3 columns, excuse me, where we see some cognados perfectos, cognados similares, and cognados falsos. So this is something that your students can start contributing to. And even if they find a word, you can have that conversation and that discussion with your students. Or it's like, is it similar? Is it perfect? Or is it a false cognate? Do they really share meaning? So this can even turn kind of like into a game and having these conversations with your students. So anytime you have these type of posters, they don't need to be pretty, they don't need to be perfect. They should conduce to really interesting conversations with your students. Another way to organize your cognates in your classroom is by having charts for a specific type of cognates. We see the chart that has the sion and shon cognates side by side. So the teacher might teach that many of the words in Spanish that end in sion with a C, they have cognates in English that end in shon with a T-I-O-N. So the teacher, as you can see, hopefully you can see it in the poster, the first 4 or 5 examples look like they have been written by the teacher. So the teacher says, oh, solución, do we know a similar word in English? Oh, solution. We notice that the ending sion and here is shon. When I look at colección, it's also sion, collection. So you start adding to the wall, and as it goes down, you're starting to see that it's the students that start to add to the poster. So if they find any cognates that fit this rule, they can start adding it to their poster. The other poster on the right has different endings side by side, and you might have a lot of these that come from that document that I previously shared from New York, where you have the cognates organized by their endings or their suffixes. So that's another way, and this might really benefit our students when they're reading to understand and expand their vocabulary, and also when they're writing. If they're not exactly sure how to spell a word, they might go to a resource like this to check. And I was like, oh, if it says famoso and it's famous, that those sounds, those vowels are tricky, so am I gonna see that it's O-U-S? So these are things that are good resources to have in your classroom to help your students in their communication, both oral and written. The next strategy that we're going to explore is the bridge or el puente. This is a strategy that has 2 purposes. The first one is to transfer academic language learned in one language into the other language. But then it has a second purpose that in my book is the most important one, which is to put the 2 languages side by side and analyze the similarities and differences between the 2. We call this metalinguistic analysis, contrastive analysis. So that's teaching for transfer. This strategy comes from the work of Karen Beeman and Cheryl Euro in their book, Teaching for Biliteracy. If you're not familiar with this book, it's super interesting. It's easy to read, and it talks about this strategy of the bridge. And it puts the 2 languages side by side. And before we look at some examples of bridge lessons, I wanted to acknowledge that sometimes you're going to hear about the bridge as a strategy, as a lesson, and sometimes we talk about bridging. The bridge is this strategy that these 2 scholars created, which is putting the 2 languages side by side in a certain way and then analyzing. And bridging is something that happens more fluently. As bilingual teachers, I feel like we help our students bridge and make connections between their 2 languages and have conversations that to help them make sense of their 2 languages. We're bridging, right? We always want to value and acknowledge their connections and have a quick conversation. And that's what we call those teachable moments, right? We're bridging, we're helping them make those connections between the 2 languages. But when we talk about the bridge as a strategy, we might be talking about a lesson that at the end looks something like this. This is an example from DPS where we use blue for Spanish and green for English. And this is, we were doing part of a unit in Spanish and then part of a unit in English. So at the time of transferring from one language to the other, the teacher reviews with the students or their main learning about that concept, that unit. In this case, they had been learning about and reading about famous inventors. So they review everything that they learned in Spanish, right? So they had something about these 3 inventors. And then the teacher asked the students how they would say it in English. So they go through this translation activity with the student input. It's not that the teacher tells them how to say it, but the teacher, together with the students, create this chart. And then the bridge chart gives birth or helps create a metalinguistic analysis or contrastive analysis chart, where the teacher focuses on an aspect of the language to put them side by side and help students understand and see the connections and differences between the similarities, and differences between the two. The first couple of examples are going to come directly from the bridge chart that was created together between the teacher and the student. And then they're going to create a contrastive analysis chart where the teacher is going to focus on something. In this case, they chose focusing on past tense verbs. And you can see how the teacher is saying, oh, in a lot of the verbs in Spanish, I noticed that and then o con acento, right? Inventó, mostró. Those regular verbs, many times when you say them in English, they end with ed. So the teacher will show this rule to the students, and then the students are going to try to find some other examples that fit that rule that the teacher just said. Of course, there's a lot of exceptions to the rule, so the teacher is going to be the facilitator of learning there and help the students find examples that fit. You can do this with cognates, you can do this with a lot of different things. So with that being said, we want to make sure that when we do the contrastive analysis, when we put the two languages side by side, we always try to focus on one thing. The teacher, you might see that from your bridge chart, you could talk about the noun and adjective order, and you can talk about cognates, and you can talk about prepositions, and you can talk about a lot of different things. We highly recommend that you focus on one thing at a time. And when we talk about focusing on something and choosing an area of focus, these are the four big umbrella areas that the teacher can think about. They can focus on the phonology of the two languages. And that could be the example of like, let's look at all the vowel sounds. We have vowels in both languages. And then she's going to help the students notice that in Spanish, there's 5 vowels, 5 sounds. Well, in English is not so much the case. So put them side by side and analyze that. You might focus on the morphology of the two languages, which is the word formation. This is where the cognates might come to play, the endings, the prefixes, suffixes, and the connections that exist between the two languages. You can focus on the syntax and grammar. In other words, the structure of the two languages. Like I shared before, you might have a lot of examples of sentences that have a noun and an adjective and see how they switch places in the languages and talk about that, find examples of that. Or you can focus on the pragmatics of the languages, and this is how languages are used. An example to understand pragmatics is focusing on verbs and conjugation, and how in Spanish we have 2 registers. We can talk about formal or informal. I might say, tú lee tu libro, o usted lea su libro. Well, in English, we only use the you. So whether you are talking to someone in a formal setting or a more informal setting, you always use you and the verb. So that's the difference between the two languages. Something else that is going to guide your decision on what to focus on for that metalinguistic or contrastive analysis is your student language production. It's always highly recommended that we pay attention to the way our students are communicating orally and in writing. So we know that as teachers, we're constantly, right, listening to our students and looking at their work and grading their writing. We're going to start seeing that our bilingual students, we're going to see signs of transfer. So whenever we see that they transfer something that it's either negative or kind of like partial or neutral, we want to pay attention to that and decide how to help them understand how each one of the languages work. Something that guides our planning also is the standards. We have to teach by the standards. A lot of the curriculum that we follow goes by the standards. So when we see that our students might be needing some type of instruction and we're not sure if that applies to our grade level, the Common Core State Standards might be a good place to go, especially to the foundational skills and the language sections of literacy. I'm sharing here a document that the San Diego Department of Education put together, where they put the Spanish standard, the Common Core State Standards, and they translated it into Spanish. So within the same document, you see English and Spanish for all the areas of literacy. And anytime we see the light blue on the Spanish side, that means that there's something that is unique to Spanish that we need to teach differently. So one example is the use of commas or colons when we're writing a letter. So when you're writing a letter, we write letters in both languages. It's one of the standards that we have to teach in 2nd grade. So if you look at these language standards, in standard 2B, we see that you use a comma in greetings and closings in letters, right? You say, dear teacher, comma. In Spanish, when we write a letter, after that greeting of querida maestra, we don't say comma, but we do a colon. So we want to show our students that. And this is a document. You have it in the note catcher, and hopefully, Liliana, you can also put it in the chat box. But this is a great resource that shows us some of the things that are unique to Spanish. Again, some things transfer positively. So when you look at the reading literature, reading information, writing, speaking, there's a lot of things that are the same, that you're not going to see any light blue. But in the sections of foundational skills, or destrezas fundamentales en lenguaje, you're going to see a lot of light blue, and it's super interesting that bilingual teachers are aware of this, so we're not teaching the same as if it was in English and translating it into Spanish. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. So this is a document that is golden to me. I go into it sometimes and I look, and I was like, is this something that kindergarteners should be learning, or is it in 1st grade, and what's specific about this part of language that students need to know? So that's a document that might help you when you're planning for metalinguistic or contrastive analysis, to find your area of focus based on your students' need. The 3rd strategy that we're going to go into is the dictado. Both as a teacher and as a support coordinator at the district level, I love the dictado. My teachers love the dictado. My students loved the dictado, and I love teaching it. So the dictado is a strategy that comes from Literacy Squared, and it's a tool that really helps you analyze English and Spanish side by side. It helps with students writing, it helps with vocabulary, it helps with a lot of things for your instruction. But what I really like about this strategy is that for bilingual teachers, you can alternate English and Spanish weeks. So you do a dictado passage in Spanish one week, and the next week is in English. So you're planning 2 weeks at a time to make sure that there are linguistic connections between your paragraphs. You want to make sure that your passages are not exactly the same. They don't need to be a translation of the other language, but you do want to make sure that they share something in a language aspect, so students can see the similarities and differences. If you're not familiar with this strategy, in the book by Literacy from the Start, written by the Literacy Square team, led by Dr. Kathy Escamilla, you can read about this strategy in detail. You want to teach, so you can teach this in person or remotely. The one thing, based on the feedback that we got from teachers in Denver at least, is that the teachers that were able to teach it remotely were the teachers that had already been implementing in person. So they said that it was easy to take it to the remote setting because they had already taught the process of the dictado. The dictado is a beautiful strategy where the teacher has a role in the lesson, and the students play a really important role in the lesson. So they have their materials, and they know the order and what to do. There's posters that helps them with their corrections, as we're going to see very soon. So just something to keep in mind, that we heard that some teachers starting it remotely might have been a little bit tricky. So if you're already implementing the dictado, or you were implementing in the spring, it might be easier if you have the same group of students. So the dictado, pretty much, it starts with, like, you dictate a passage. You have a passage that you're going to read to your students, with your students, and for your students as they write. So when you're doing that dictation part of the strategy, you could do it synchronously or asynchronously. If you're doing it live in front of students, you might do it through Google Meet or Zoom, if your district allows you to use Zoom with students. And you're going to be in front of students, and you're going to present your text, and you're going to say, today we're going to write a passage that is connected to our social studies, for example, that we're learning. It has a connection to our social studies content. The first time I'm going to read it to you. The second time the teacher is going to read, and the students are going to echo the teacher. And then this teacher is going to read, pause, so that the students can write what the teacher says. So if you do it synchronously, you can do it with your students and follow the same process. You pause while they're repeating or writing. If you do it asynchronously, you might use one of these documents that I have on the screen, Screencastify or Loom. They offer, the basic version is free for teachers. or you can use Seesaw because you can also record videos. I believe they're shorter videos that you can include, but it might work. The one thing to pay attention to is like if you're dictating, you might say, okay, I'm going to pause. When I pause, you should be writing, but students can do it in their own time. The second part, and maybe the most important part of the dictado, is the talk through. That time where the teacher is writing the text in front of the students with their input and sharing her thinking or his thinking. So it might look like something like this. Our passage is birthdays. Today is my birthday. When is your birthday? If the teacher wants to really focus on punctuation and going back to that 1 question mark in English versus 2 question marks in Spanish, the teacher might stop there and say, okay, this is a question and I'm writing in English. Do I need a question mark at the end or do I need both, right? So it's going to be eliciting a conversation between the teacher and the student between similarities and differences between the two. If you do it live or synchronously, you might have like chart paper behind you or an easel or a piece of paper that you can share with your students and they can see what you're writing. If you do it asynchronously, you might record yourself using Screencastify or Loom or a similar tool where you might be typing on a Google Doc and explaining your thinking. You're sharing your thinking with students as you go. And then for the self-corrections, the dictado is very big on like students learn how to find their own approximations and errors and mark them. So you can ask your students to take a picture of their writing with the corrections and then share it with you. And they can share it on Seesaw, for example, so you can provide some feedback. So again, these are some ideas on how to implement the dictado. The last strategy that I wanted to share has to do with bilingual books. We know that a lot of the books that are published come in 2 languages, or sometimes they have versions of English and Spanish. In this example of Good Night Moon or Buenas Noches Luna, the author there is a version of the book that is bilingual, so it has in one page the 2 languages. So the teacher, even though she might be reading it in one language or the other, she might be wanting to help students find cognates. So when we find the cognate telephone and teléfono, we might pay attention to the phonology and the morphology of those cognates and saying, telephone and telephone, they're cognates. I know they're cognates because they sound similar, they look similar, and they mean the same. I'm always picturing that element, that instrument that I used to make calls, and it's in the picture of the book. But I see that there's a PH for F in English, while there's an F in Spanish. And there they can have the conversation about how in Spanish, it's always the letter F that produces the sound F, while in English, you can have the F or the PH digraph. You can also focus on the syntax and the grammar. If you look at the sentence level and you're saying in the green room or en la habitación verde, right? Or the red balloon and el globo rojo, how the noun and the adjective are in different order depending on the language. Sometimes you can have a bilingual book, but you want to give your students access to the same book in the other language, and you might pick a piece of that book and have that conversation with your students about how a sentence was constructed in the same way or differently. So that's something that you can do to put the 2 languages side by side in context. If you're looking for resources, either in Spanish or bilingual resources, the COCABE website, in the library section, we keep adding resources. So feel free to go in there. There's the link on the screen and it's also in your note catcher. So this might be a good place for you to find some of the resources that might help you share it with your students and their families. Also, Flipgrid, when students read books, whether in English or in Spanish, it's always great to invite them to talk about the book or to answer a specific question about comprehension. So Flipgrid is an app that is free for educators. So once you go into flipgrid.com, you create your account, and then you can create an assignment for students. So, it's a very short video that you're asking them to record. You just share a link that Flipgrid will give you. You share it with your students and they can share a video with you, and that's a great way to see them and hear their language production, whether it's in English or in Spanish. And you might catch a lot of things that have to do with language transfer when you hear them and see them on video. I shared a short tutorial on how to use Flipgrid if this is something you're interested in. And also, I created an assignment, so I would love to get to know who was in the session, if you have any specific questions, if you have comments about it, if you want to share anything with me or just introduce yourself, feel free to go into flipgrid.com/co-transfer. That's something that I'm going to be checking and I'll respond. This is something that I created because I thought it would be a good opportunity for you to play with Flipgrid and try it in a fun way. And then if you decide that this is something that you want to share with your students, Flipgrid is also compatible with a lot of the platforms that schools are using. I know they can use it with Seesaw. You can upload that code and students just go into it and then they upload their comments. So it's a fun strategy. It's a fun, app, and it's a way to communicate with students and hear them and see them, even though you can't see them in person. So just something to consider. So with that being said, this is all I have to share today. I want to thank you very much for coming today. I hope to see many of your faces on Saturday at the Cognates Cafe. This is going to be, again, a very informal space. You may choose to come for the whole 90 minutes or just come for a little bit. My colleagues Paulina and Liliana are recording all your questions from today. We're going to save them and go over some of those. If you can't attend, we're planning on recording it as well. So we're going to be sharing on the Cognates website. Feel also free to shoot me an email if you have any specific questions or anything you would like to share. And like Jorge said in the beginning, we appreciate your feedback about today's session and about what you would like to see in future sessions. So with that being said, that's all I have to share.